Mike, welcome back to the show, buddy.
Hey, Mark. Glad to be back, man. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been a while. You were on. Shoot, I should have looked up what episode number. For those listening and watching, Mike was on the show. I
It
think
was
you
early
were in
on.
very early on. You were in the first maybe half dozen episodes, way back when
Yeah.
I didn't know what the heck I was doing. I probably still don't, but at
We're
least
still
I
figuring
have
it out. It's all right.
I have a few more episodes under my belt now. But yeah, for those of you who really want to know more about Mike, go back and find that episode again. I think it's in the first 5 or 6 episodes. But today, buddy, we're going to dive into this book that you've written,
Nice.
called Tending the Fire, Ignite Your Heart, and Live Life as a Man. But before we get into that, I've got to ask, you are just fairly fresh off a, 5-week anniversary trip?
Yeah, 5 weeks. Yeah, we basically, my wife and I, you'll kind of get some of this. Whoever reads the book, you'll get a little bit of this. The 25 years almost didn't happen, and it almost didn't happen several times. And so when we finally got to 25 years and we had, things were going really well for us, we said, let's go do something. And we were like, we're in North Carolina, so we're in Charlotte. And we were like, what place is open right now? Like, doesn't require a mask and all that kind of stuff has kind of settled down. And granted, things had already started to open up just about everywhere, but Texas was pretty open and we had never been there. And we said, let's just go to Texas. Let's just go. Everybody talks about Texas. We've never been. So we drove all the way from Charlotte and, saw some family along the way and did some other things. But yeah, we got to see Texas and did a little tour, kind of a big tour of Texas. We did Houston, just passing through, and then Austin, which people are going to say that's not Texas, but we went to Austin, and then we went to San Antonio for several days. We went to Big Bend National Park and lots of little springs and things like that all between. So it was pretty awesome.
Yeah, well, congratulations on 25 years. That is no
Thanks.
small feat. And yeah, I think, like you said, you guys went through some patches and now you're good to go. That's not to say there won't be stuff in the future, but you got to celebrate those wins.
Absolutely.
So good for you for time out and just spending time together. Did you do any work on the road or were you completely unplugged?
No, we did. And it was, so one of the things that was happening was my book was actually coming out while I was on the road. And so this was not good timing for publishers or as a self-published guy. So a little note to anybody else, don't plan your big wedding trip while you're out, while you're trying to be publishing your book. But so the book was coming out and I'm trying to promote that and do some things. But one of the things that we've learned about ourselves is that, yeah, we want to be away, we want to be doing stuff, but the reality is we still have like responsibilities. We've got businesses to take care of. We got other things going on. And so as much as possible, we try to give each other, like my wife and I, a heads up as to what the expectation should be. Like, hey, we're going to spend these 3 days just focused on each other. And then we're going to have a downtime where it's just, we got to get some work done. I'm going to go to the coffee shop. She's going to go do whatever and get some stuff done. And I think a lot of that comes back down to communication. It's just talking about what's going to be happening, and setting expectations. Because before, what would happen is we'd go on a trip someplace and I'm on my phone trying to just kind of do stuff on the side. And she's getting frustrated because I'm not really present or, something like that. And, or now that we both own, a business, Rustic in Maine, our other business, that's, that kind of takes up our time as well. So we're both kind of in that mode of like, oh, the business has a question or we need to do this thing. And we just have to turn that off or, try to schedule that time and set those expectations.
No, that's smart. So without getting into like too many personal details, like now that you're home and you can reflect back on that, like what did you learn about, I guess, yourself as a result of that? Did you have any like big aha moments or takeaways or
on the trip?
Of the trip? Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that we learned about each other is that when you don't have kids on the trip, it's a lot easier and you can have a lot more fun because we haven't done a lot of trips, but most of them have been family trips. And so we've not done a lot of stuff like long-term away from home type of stuff, just us. We got married young. So, our kids were kind of always in the mix. And so we had a lot of fun just kind of playing things by ear and just kind of doing what we wanted to do. So it was less stressful, which was good. And our boys are growing up now. They're like 18 and 21. And then the other thing was that we have fun together. And that was, it shouldn't be surprising, but it's always a bit of a test. Like if you're going to go on the road for 5 weeks, you're kind of like, man, we're going to drive each other nuts, or this is going to work out really good, you know? And it worked out really well. We just had good communication. We had fun. I did some of the things that she wanted to do. That was kind of like, meh for me. She did some of the things that I wanted to do. That was kind of like, meh for her. But it was, and then we did things together that we both really enjoyed. Usually it was eating someplace. And, you know, that was just really good. Yeah, it was really good. Um, the other thing that I think she helps me come out of my shell on some things where like I might go on a vacation and I'm just kind of like, I don't really know what I want from this. Like we went to Big Bend National Park and, you know, we're in Terlingua, which is a little town outside of Big Bend. And it's very desert, kind of old school. It used to be an old mining town and still has a lot of that feel to it. And one of the things that she kind of recognized and she thought was kind of cool was that I'm always looking for like arrowheads. Like wherever I am, I'm always just looking for artifacts and old stuff. And so I'm walking around just like looking at the ground, you know, and and instead of being like, you know, why are you looking at the ground all the time? She's like, are you finding anything? Did you see anything cool? Look at this rock. You know, she'd kind of join me in those things. And so it kind of helped me realize like, oh, there's this thing that I do. I didn't even realize that I did it until, you know, she kind of noticed it and kind of drew that out. You know, she's always looking for art. She's always looking for places to swim and stuff. So we're still learning stuff about each other.
That's cool, man. Yeah, and it's so important. You got to do it because, especially, I can say this because my wife and I also had children very young.
Yeah.
And when you start life, or when you are taking care of kids at such an early age, you don't have those years of just being together as husband and wife, right?
Yeah.
So you got to take advantage of those times, those opportunities to spend time together, because if you don't, you know, your kids are going to be grown and gone at some point, and then you find yourselves like, oh, this is the first time we've really spent time together as a couple. And at that point, it's like, if you haven't nurtured it along the way, it can be a struggle for some people.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Because you get together and you're like, you're still in that same mode as whatever that dynamic that you developed as parents becomes the defining dynamic of your relationship. And it doesn't have to be. Now you can kind of be like individuals again and really appreciate each other again. And it's different. And you got to work on that. It's an adventure. It's something to be explored. And for people who got married young, had kids young, and didn't have that time to figure each other out, that sort of honeymoon phase, this is like virgin territory. When you get to this, it's like, okay, now what? Now who are we? 25 years later, you know, who are we now? And let me get to know you and appreciate you and those kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, cool, man. Glad you guys had an opportunity to do that. Let's dive into this book. I'm going to start off by saying,
it sucks.
Up until no.
This is always the fear of every author. It's like, you know, let's dive into your book. Well, on page 37, you said, you know, that's factually incorrect. What actually happened was, you know.
No, up until recently, I held, and I know you are familiar with this book. I held this book in high regard, and I still do. It's a great book.
It's a fantastic book.
But I'm going to be completely honest with you. I feel like your book needs to be in the same conversation.
Oh, dude, that's awesome.
I really enjoyed it. I'm in full transparency. I'm still reading it, but what I've read so far, I love it. And I love how it's structured. And I also love, you did a really good job of letting your unique voice come through, because you have, I don't know if you know this, but you almost have like this poetic way of speaking sometimes.
I've been told that. Yeah.
Yeah. And it comes through in this book.
That's good.
So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I do appreciate that as well. And I have been told that, which surprised me. I guess I do it because people have told me that. I remember talking about just voices. I remember calling my dad one time. This was when I was just getting into podcasting, and I was kind of like, Dad, why don't I have a cool like Southern accent with all this like drawl and everything else everybody's got in my family? I was like, my dad had this really, really animated voice. He died several years ago, or a few years ago, but he had a very animated voice. All of his side of the family had a very animated voice. And I didn't get that, but I still wanted to have a voice of some kind. Anyhow, and he said something interesting, which I thought was, it just stuck with me. He said, because I thought me telling him that he had an animated voice was probably like new to him, but he said, no, he said he had girlfriends or a girlfriend one time that would ask him why he sang when he talked. And I thought that
Oh,
was
wow.
kind of, and that was kind of a poetic thing, right, to say even, and kind
Yeah.
of a beauty to it. And I love that. And I always thought, man, I want to have some characteristic about how I come across that is unique enough where people would remember that, because I think we do. We remember people who just have something a little bit different, and whether it's the way they speak or the way they think or something like that, I wanted to have that unique. And so I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah. It is interesting though. If you grew up surrounded with people who have that, I'll call it that Southern drawl or that
Yeah.
twang, as we like to say in the Midwest, that you didn't pick up on any of that. That's
No, I
odd.
I I blame MTV, actually. I think too much MTV and just, watching shows, and I don't know. I didn't realize that I didn't have it until I got older, and I was like, "Well, why do I sound like this?" And everybody else has, like, a cool little country kinda thing going. I don't know. So, I roll with
Yeah.
it.
Well, this book is, like I said, it's a great book. And I think it's one that's really needed right now.
Thank you.
I know that you kind of call out the problems that we're facing as a society, due to the lack of manhood, and really outline some key principles that every man needs to live by in order to feel truly alive. And so, um, let's just start there. I mean, when we talk about a lack of manhood,
Yeah.
what do you mean by manhood in general? I mean, I have my own definition, everybody else
Yeah.
does, but I'm curious to hear yours.
When I talk about manhood, this is part of the problem of writing this kind of book or any kind of self-help book that's not it's not kind of boxed in. So when I say, well, manhood means you're providing for your family, and keep your commitments, and you love your wife, and nurture your kids, and you do all these things. Maybe you're setting the example after Christ, or you're working on yourself, you're working on your strength, these types of things. Well, the list really doesn't end. And so when you're writing a book like this, when I was putting this together, I'm like, well, how do I kind of cap these things off and provide just some basic definitions about just some places for guys to kind of start and say, yeah, that speaks to me as a man. And so we talk about things like living spiritually, living courageously, living truthfully, those kinds of things that are in the book. Those are areas in which a man needs to focus to be a man. But at the same time, you know, uh, when I see, there's like the epitome of like what the most masculine man is. He's strong, he's capable, he does all the, he's I don't know, he's reliant on himself, but he also has a good bit of, spirit of putting back into the community and other people. Those are all great. Like that's a fantastic definition. But at the same time, I know guys that they can't change their oil, but man, they are an amazing father. Or they love people, they serve people like crazy, even to their own detriment. There's a lot of manliness and aspects to what they do. So, I don't know if there's like a one sentence definition. I think if there was, I would probably be like, well, that's it. So, no need for a book. I think there's a lot
Yeah.
to it. And
Pamphlet.
a pamphlet, yeah, a pamphlet, yeah. The but the truth is, it's something that we recognize when we see it. We recognize that there's a difference between someone living out the virtues they're all good as a woman versus someone living those virtues out as a man. And I think that that's something that we intuitively know almost more than we could identify. Like, women can be courageous, men can be courageous, but the way a woman demonstrates that is different than the way a man demonstrates that. It just is. And but yet they're both equally important.
So I shouldn't say always, but I'll use politicians as an example when it comes to manhood. And I do this because I feel like many of our politicians today deserve to be thrown under the bus. So I don't have a problem saying
Yeah.
not all politicians are bad, but many of them are, you look back in history and so many of our leaders are what we would consider to be manly men, right? Theodore
Sure.
Roosevelt comes to mind, obviously.
Yeah.
Winston Churchill. They've got these qualities of uh, accepting responsibility, right? Doing what needs to be done despite the cost. They were tested, right? Many times in battle or war.
Yeah.
And you just don't find those qualities in today's leaders for the most part.
Yeah.
And so I don't know where I'm going with this. I just think that this book does a good job of unpacking what we're lacking in manhood today, and then just laying out very clearly. And it's not an exhaustive list by any means, but here's some practical ways to reclaim manhood.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I call out some of the spineless politicians and those kinds of things in the book. And it's true. I mean, like, this is part of the problem, is that we don't see it. We don't see men being men. If you think about the commercials, for those who still watch commercials, you think about the TV shows, maybe even some of the movies. I mean, some of the superhero movies have kind of like done a better job, I guess. But for the most part, the men that are demonstrated on in these platforms, and then of course the politicians themselves, they're very soft spoken. They kind of check the wind before they speak. The guys that are on commercials are usually buffoons, idiots of some kind. The guys that are on television shows are usually some kind of a feminized version of a male, and they just don't really come across as like this strong masculine presence. And yet at the same time, these are some of the most influential characters in our lives. I mean, what we see on TV, the guys that we hear from as politicians, the people that are supposed to be our leaders, they're soft, and they're not masculine. And so and that's the thing. You and I see that, we recognize that, because it's a striking difference between the men of old, like you talked about. But I think there's a generation coming up that they don't know the difference. That
Right.
they haven't seen the difference, and I think it's our responsibility to kind of bring that forward, to say, hey, look, I'm a man living out here as a man. I'm tending to my fire, and I'm working on growing. I'm not going to do it perfectly, but I'm going to show you something different than what you're going to get, through the media and social media and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And sad to say, I feel like there's a segment of the next generation that they're completely blind to it. Like, they don't even know what they don't know when it comes to manhood.
Yeah.
So when you think about it through that lens, it's like, that seems like a really hard hurdle to overcome.
Yep. 100%. Because I mean, like, I had my grandfather. I didn't have a permanent father figure in my life, but my grandfather was that for me. I've talked to so many men who are around our age that have similar experiences, either their dad or especially their grandfather, who was raised in that tougher generation, maybe, served in World War II, Korea, something like that. And they bring something to the table that is going away because they're dying off, unfortunately. And so we're losing that generation. We have an example of that in our life. We know what that looks like. We know what a man looks like, to kind of tend to his own field, tend to his fire, those kinds of things. But the next generation, they've missed that so much that they just, their dads may not have had it. But it's important that we bring that forward, because they're going to be drawn to it. In their 20s, they may not be. In their 20s, they might just be like, hey, I just want to be a social media influencer, whatever people's, dream job is these days. I don't know, a YouTube guy. Maybe that's what but then at some point when they get into their later 20s and their early 30s, they go, something's missing here. I need something in my life. And there better be a man, hopefully a good Christian man, a godly man around them to say, hey, I'm going to show you the way. Pay attention to what I've got going on over here. It's going to satisfy you where these other things are going to leave you wanting.
Yeah, 100%. Oh, and I think this book and others like it are good tools to supplement those efforts.
This podcast is part of the Edify Podcast Network. Edify is a faith-inspiring app that brings together thousands of the best Christian podcasts in one place for your listening enjoyment. Cut through the noise and grow your faith by diving into the world's top Christian podcasts today. Download the Edify app for free from the App Store or Google Play, or by going to edify.app. That's edifi.app.
Let's unpack this thing a little bit more. I'm not giving away too much of the book because this is in the chapter outline, but when you talk about, like, here's how you do it, you list 5 principles of living manfully, and that's living deliberately, courageously, virtuously, truthfully, and spiritually.
Yeah.
How did you land on those 5?
Yeah, this was tough because I began writing this book about 6 years ago, and I was like, well, where do I stop? Like, these are just some areas, but like I said before, like, where do I actually stop with this thing? Because there's so many other virtues that we could talk about. And I really thought, what has to be there as kind of a foundation for a man to really put on these other virtues? Well, he's got to be courageous. He's got to have the courage to kind of like be that guy, what we call first courage. Like I'm willing to stand out from the crowd. I'm willing to be known as different
Mm-hmm.
by saying I'm going to, hold to certain values. He's got to be intentional. He's got to live and love truth. So that's got to be there. Right. And then spiritually, of course, that was a big piece as well. And that was a really hard one to kind of nail down as to how I wanted to define that. Um, but yeah, they really just sort of these are the building blocks that I think every guy, like if you tackle these, because you could have said something like, I could have said, well, a man needs to be, I don't know, financially savvy or frugal or something. Well, that's important, but it's not a foundational thing. That's something that you kind of get after you've got some of the other pieces in place. We're really talking about a character war, spiritual war, but a character war that we're up against right now. And so we really need, like, what are these fundamentals, especially the ones that guys aren't talked about. Guys hear all the time about how they need to make more money or they need to, be buffer and that kind of stuff, right? We need to get all yoked up and jacked, which is good. But we don't really hear about being, deliberate with our time and our energy or being truthful or, what does spiritual mean? Is it, how do we define that? What does that look like? Why should we even care about that? So, and a lot of these things I had to talk about kind of from the ground up, thinking that some guys are coming to this with no knowledge at all about what any of these are foundationally.
Well, they really resonated with me. And I've talked about some of these concepts on my show before too, but like start with living deliberately. I think today, and I can speak to this because I'm guilty of it. So many of us are. It's very easy to, get home from work, come home, plop down on the couch or in the recliner and just pull out the phone and just start scrolling through social media, not with the intent of spending a lot of time there, but just like, oh, I didn't have a chance to do this today. Let's see what's going on. An hour goes by in the blink of an eye.
Yep.
All the while your kids are wanting your attention. Your wife maybe needs you to, your wife miss you during the day too. And maybe she needs you to help out around the house. And here you are just lost in the digital landscape of social media. And so that's just maybe one tiny example of not being deliberate with your time and getting sucked into that, the time suck of social media.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah. And that's being deliberate and being intentional, I think is probably one of the key things that's going to separate the people who succeed in the next generation versus those who don't. And when I mean success, I don't mean just financially, like you're a big star of some kind or whatever, but I mean just like you can look back in your life and you go, wow, that was meaningful. I felt like I had purpose, because it takes intentionality. And really, like never before, we're at a place where we're constantly being pulled to be unintentional about everything. I posted something the other day that I got off of Instagram, where Instagram is basically saying we're an entertainment platform now. We're not primarily a photo platform. I mean, obviously, anybody who's on there should have seen this coming, but basically that means that they want the 15-second videos. They want the quick little things that make you go, oh, wow, and just keep scrolling. Yep. Whereas it used to be, I want to see awesome photos. I want to see, how people's businesses work from the inside. I want to see people telling stories and those kinds of things. And so much of what the next generation is getting kind of tuned into is don't be intentional, waste your time, just limited focus and do whatever feels good in the moment. And if it's not one of those things, you're probably doing something wrong. That's kind of what they teach. And it's got to be intentionality. You've got to be deliberate. You've got to say, how do I want my day to go? How do I want my life to go? What do I want to have happen to me this year? What are the main things I've got to do today? I mean, like all these things just kind of happen. And you can even have some deliberate downtime where you're like, okay, it's 9:30 at night, or it's 8:30, or whatever time is you pick. No more work, nothing else. I'm playing with the kids, or I'm watching TV, or whatever it is, but just be intentional about it.
Yeah. Downtime shouldn't happen by accident. You got to plan it.
Yeah.
In our busy days, it's, if you don't plan that downtime, it doesn't happen, or it does. And it's, not as fruitful as it can be because you're not intentional about it. I'm gonna go back to the comment you made about being successful, and success looks different for everybody, as it should. But as you scroll through Instagram, you see example after example of people achieving high success.
Everybody's successful on Instagram. It's nice.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's not real, but it's a reminder that the people who achieve success, I use air quotes there for people listening. They have the same 24 hours in a day that we do.
Yeah.
Difference is they're just more intentional or deliberate with their time than we are.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. There's the book that I wrote before this one, kind of in between writing this one, was The Guy's Guide to Pocket Knives. Small little book. It's a fun little book if you like knives, which most guys do. And I wrote most of it during my lunch hour when I had a full-time job. A publisher reached out to me and said, "Hey, we'd like for you to, possibly write this book on pocket knives. Here's kind of what we're thinking." We negotiated some stuff, and I said, "Sure." And I thought, well, I've got this time when I'm usually writing blogs for Wolf and Iron. I'll just shift that and I'll just write this book instead. And so people were like, "Well, Mike, how did you write a book, while you're raising kids and how did you start this other side business? How did you do these other things?" I'm like, I just think about the stuff that I want to get done and how's that going to happen in my day? Like this podcast, this is right now, something else is not getting done because I'm doing this, but I think this is important. And so I make time for it. And the same is true at night. Like if I know I've got to get up at 4:30 in the morning because I'm starting this weird ring making business that we kicked off, and I've got to make some rings on the side, do my side hustle. Well, I'm going to go to bed at like 8:30 or 9, which means I've got to get everything else done, in that time. So it's just being, like I said, it's just being intentional and planning. And sometimes this is like basic stuff that we all should know, but it's been out of focus for so long. And it seems almost antiquated, but you're like, no, this is how you get things done. This is how you succeed in life. You actually sit down, you plan your day out, and you just, chop it down, take the tree down one chop at a time, and eventually it's going to fall. So.
Well, I think it just underscores the importance of having a vision for your life, right? Having a purpose in mind. When when you get up at the beginning of the day, striving to achieve X, Y, and Z, then it becomes easier to be deliberate throughout the day because you've got to do this and this and this, or you're not going to achieve this.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of people need to recognize in themselves if they truly want something or if they just wish something were. So for example,
right.
I want to be an author, so I write books. If I just had some stories in my head and I wished that I could be an author, sometimes they feel the same before it really happens, but you got to recognize in yourself, like, what things in life do I really want? I can't go after all of it. And what kind of things do I just kind of, everybody wishes they could be discovered, but if you really want something, you got to pursue it. You got to put forth the effort. Otherwise, it's just wishing. You're really just wishful thinking. I wish I was successful. I wish I had a different life or a different car, or I wish I were married, or I wish I, this or that. And that's not the same thing as like action and actually getting after it.
Yeah. Well, case in point, you got after it with your Wolf and Iron blog. And because of those actions, you were approached by a publisher. Yeah. So had you not taken the steps to sit down and blog consistently over time, you never would have been noticed by a publisher. You never would have had that opportunity.
Right.
And then who knows what that led to, right? If you never would have written that first book, maybe you wouldn't have been inspired to chase these other endeavors that you've got going on.
Yeah. Every win needs to be celebrated, and you need to recognize that it's a stepping stone for something else. It's going to open up doors for you that you didn't expect. That little pocket knife book, I've been told by people, almost with tears in their eyes, that they read it or they gave it to someone who was, dying, and that guy loved it, thought it was great. And, it was just a small thing in a sense, because it's just a little book, but that you could bring joy to somebody's life, that it could mean something to somebody like that, that they would want to make a connection with something meaningful in their life and something that you did. Like, that can't happen without that kind of work up front. And so you really got to want it and you got to pursue it. So once again, intentionality.
It's an important one. I want to unpack courageous living here a little bit. We were talking about that earlier. You mentioned being willing to be different or something along those lines. And man, I just feel like that is such an important point, especially when I think about raising my son. Peer pressure is a real thing. And we try to limit screen time with him, and he doesn't really have a phone that is necessarily his. So he doesn't have any social media accounts, but he's still exposed to all that through friends and whatnot. It's impossible to shield them from all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And as they get exposed to all of these influencers and, all the messages that media is cramming down their throats, it's very easy for young, impressionable people, especially, this show focuses on fatherhood. Where was I going with this thought? It's very easy for them to get caught up in the current or the flow of our culture and get carried away in the wrong direction. And it takes courage for them to stand up for what's right, for what, in a way that live in a way that God wants them to live versus how their friends or society wants them to live. And so I've found that's not something that you can teach necessarily, but it's something you have to model. You have to live out and let them see you do that.
Yep.
I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Anything to add to that idea?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think you got to model it. I think you've got, as a parent, both moms and dads need to do this, but it may come more strongly or more, it may have more of an impact coming from dad, is helping our kids see it. So when they do take a little step to stand up for something, whatever it is, whatever that small thing is, man, that needs to be encouraged big time. Hey, I saw when you were at that birthday party, just making up something. I saw when you were at this birthday party and that kid was sitting in the corner and he didn't know anybody and you went over and said hey to him. That was really cool. You stepped away from what everybody else was doing, stepped out of the crowd to make sure somebody else was taken care of. That means that really shows a lot of, manhood or whatever the case is. They need to know that because, we're always looking for positive feedback to kind of help us in the direction that we ought to go. And so when we see those things in our kids, we need to really encourage that they did something where they broke from what everybody else was doing to follow the conviction of their own hearts and make sure that really gets kind of applauded and maybe rewarded in some kind of way. Through praise is usually the best, if not hard, cold cash. No, I'm just kidding. You give somebody money, it's just, but whatever makes it stick, because they're going to face that all throughout life, and they need to have that awareness that they're capable of doing that, and that it's going to turn out okay. And I think just a few examples of that in their life is going to make a big difference for them. In the book, I just call it first courage. It's the willingness to be that guy. It's a willingness to be the person who, I'm going to step back and even with my fear of missing out and all the FOMO or whatever that's happening, I'm going to step back before I make a judgment. I might be in line with everybody else eventually, but I'm not going to be first in line all the time, because I'm going to, whether we're talking about COVID stuff that's happened recently, or how you vote, or how you think, or how you speak out at work, whatever the case is, you got to have that courage. And I think that it's a muscle. You're just developing it over time. It doesn't matter who you are. Some people seem like they're kind of more born with it, but they just developed it, I think, at an earlier age, and others can develop it later in life.
Yeah. I also think it's important to look for opportunities to expose our kids to examples of other people, other men who have lived courageously. Right. And that's one reason why I'm careful about which movies I let my kids watch, but movies that depict courage in a historically accurate way.
Mm-hmm.
And like, these are examples of real men who did real things.
Yeah.
They went above and beyond for something that was larger than themselves. And to see that, that's a real thing that happened in real life. It's also one of the reasons why I've got, for people who watch this show, I've got some of my grandfather's war medals and whatnot on the wall behind me. And that's partially because I'm proud of it myself, but it's also a reminder and a frequent conversation starter for my son. It's like, you've got, your heritage lies in some pretty awesome war stories,
Yeah, for sure.
So finding those examples to expose your kids of real world examples of how living courageously can benefit not just yourself, but society as a whole.
And it's strange to me too, though, if we think about living courageously these days, because there is, from our viewpoint, I think there's so much ability to be who you want to be, who you feel called to be. You can be, let's say, and this is a little bit in the book, take our grandparents' generation or a generation before that. You kind of had you maybe grew up in a small town. Most people did. They had the small town jobs. They were going to marry the small town girl. They're going to kind of stay local. And most people are going to do that. That was going to be their role. And now and you could, you only had certain jobs available. I mean, and now you could be almost anything. You could be, you want to be an artist. Want to be a graphic designer. You want to own a car wash. It doesn't really matter what it is. You can be successful financially. A lot of these things are viable just because of where we are today as a society, technology, and those kinds of things. So there's so much more ability to be yourself. And yet at the same time, people still feel this real strong drive to be a part of a group, to be part of a collective kind of think. And,
Yep.
and even almost more so than I think it's ever been, which is strange because they don't even have physical associations with a lot of these people. They're just hashtag people online, groups that kind of amass themselves. And I think that is strange that, at a time when we have more freedom to be the man that you want to be, that you feel called to be, to break outside of the norm and people not think anything different about it, uh, people still feel just a really, really strong desire to be joined into what they consider a safe community. And so I think the
Yep.
people who can break out of that mold, I think they're going to make all the difference in the world.
100%. And doing so with the courage of knowing that when you step out against the grain of society or what have you, the majority, that you're probably going to be shunned. Life will become maybe a little bit more difficult for you if you do that.
Yeah, for sure. And it's in some ways we're seeing a lot more of that in the last 2 years or so with the social media sites and stuff, whether they're banning people directly, shadow banning, whatever the case is. They're basically playing a game where these major platforms, these platforms where you could really have a business, be seen, grow an audience, all that kind of stuff. If you don't align with their values, you could get, slapped on the wrist, and now you can't run ads. Now you can't have a page. Now you get totally blocked, whatever the case is. And, so there's definitely some risk, especially if you have, like we do, we have businesses that are online and we do social media quite a bit. There's definitely a risk in standing up for certain things, but that's where the courage comes in. Like that, it's real courage when there's real risk. And, and so I think if I hadn't learned some of that early on, it would be tough. It'd be easy to hide behind the business side of things and say, well, we're just a business. We're going to play by the rules of these social media places just to kind of get along and not cause a stir, instead of saying, no, we're going to stand up for the values that we believe in, even if it means we get taken down or something like that.
Yeah, 100%. And not to get too political, but I mean, we've seen a ton of this in the last, year and a half.
Yep.
I'll use the gyms as an example, especially last year, when everybody was forced to shut down, and you saw several gym owners across the country be like, no, we're still open, and under threat of, all these financial penalties and whatnot. And they their ground. And that took a lot of courage.
Big time. Yeah. Big time courage. Cause you got to have, not only are you risking your business potentially, but now you're going to fight the government, and you're going to hope that your constituents or your members, they still show up and support you. And, there's a lot that goes into it. So as you get older, it becomes more daunting. There's a lot more at risk. I often think about the founding fathers and how they really risked everything, their lives, their fortune, their sacred honor, their family name, all that stuff was on the line to build this country or to develop this country. And I think, we're getting to a place where that's happening again, unfortunately, where businesses, good people who believe in traditional values and those kinds of stuff are going to have to take a stand, and we're going to have to risk losing quite a bit in order to do so. But that's what we're called to do.
Yeah. And I feel like the conversation we've been having the last couple of minutes kind of bleeds into the virtuous living too. Like in my mind anyway, the lines between courageous living and virtuous living are a little blurry. So maybe just unpack that for us quickly. How do you distinguish the two? What does virtuous living look like and mean to you?
Yeah, I think as C.S. Lewis says, that courage is the testing point of all virtues. So basically, in order to live out anything truly virtuously, you have to have courage. So that's kind of the testing point really of any virtue. So let's say, that I believe in freedom, let's say the virtue of, being a free, independent, person, um, that really comes to test when someone else also believes in their freedom and is conflicting with my freedom. And so I've got to be willing to take a stand on what I believe in, but also take a stand in their freedom, and it takes courage to just, make a stand in those types of things. The region that I guess virtues are virtues, whether we're talking about frugality, whether we're talking about, patience, it doesn't matter. You can actually look up a list of virtues. There's tons of them. They really only, they can really only truly be tested when courage is involved. And so I think courage is the kind of the key thing that allows us to really live out a virtue. Um, uh, Maybe not necessarily a courageous thing here, but let's take frugality, for example, or just being financially wise. I have to basically tell myself no, even though credit cards and everything else are saying, yeah, come buy right now. Come get your whole house furnished for, X amount per month. And, you don't have to pay it back for another 2 years or something like that, right? There's all these things going on out there. We have to be willing to say, I'm not going to do that right now. And I'm going to do these, instead I'm going to practice patience and frugality and those kinds of things and save up for it. That's living out a virtue that, that we don't really, it's something that's not really talked about these days. Virtues aren't really discussed. We don't talk about whether it's living sacrificially. We don't talk about, courage itself as a type of virtue, but, we just don't talk about these things. And so the virtues themselves kind of undergird the different aspects of how we live our life. Courage is one of those aspects, and it's necessary to live out all the others. But, the virtues themselves are the things that, that define us as men. Virtues, I think, comes from the Latin virtus, which actually means man. And so this idea that as we live our lives as men, there's a virtue, that comes, if we were to sum it all up, it'd be called man or manhood. But we've broken it down. I think in the early in the days, like Aristotle and Plato and those guys, they had like 5 virtues, and we've got like 50 something now because we've kind of broken it down into more specific things. But yeah, that was a little bit of a tangent, but I think, and I call out several virtues in the book. I think it's something that we don't focus on. We don't talk to our kids about. We don't speak in the language of virtues. We say things like, "You did a good job today, bud." But what we really should say is, "You know what? You really took the time and did your best. You showed a lot of diligence today in what you did." Like, we need words for the things of how we live our life, and we need to do that for each other as well. Yeah, specific. And we have those available to like us in our language, but we don't really use them. And so what happens is we say, "You did a good job." Okay, well, that kind of generically helps me, but it doesn't really point me as to like what aspect of my character really was good today, And I think if we can begin to help give our kids that language, and we begin to speak to each other in that language, it's really going to help.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to living deliberately and being very deliberate in how you parent and how you speak to your kids and how you kind of build them up.
Yeah,
because if you don't do that with deliberance, then, like you said, you kind of speak in generalities, and kids may pick up on things here or there. But if we're not speaking very specifically into what they may have done well or how they could have improved, then they don't really take anything away from that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I think that back to living virtuously, I think that it's another one of those things that you can't really teach. You just have to model. And I think you touched on that earlier, but if we are not living that out ourselves, then our kids don't have anything to kind of measure that against.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely right.
Moving on to living truthfully. I preach to my kids that, if you don't have, and in terms of relationships, if truth doesn't exist there, then there's not much of a relationship there. So that's a big thing in our house, is just telling the truth, be honest. And I feel that, again, I'll go back to politics. We're lacking truth in our world today, from our politicians, from our media, from big corporations.
Yeah.
I don't feel like anybody's telling us the truth. And so again, when we talk about like modeling behavior, we've got to do it because it's not coming from the world.
Yep. No, you think about especially with the COVID stuff and everything that's going on with the elections and things like that, how nice it would have been to have like a source, a really trusted source on some of these things. You know, we have so many people talking about things, lots of blogs and lots of people who believe that they have the truth, but we really don't know if we can trust them. And that's that. Think about all the confusion that's caused and that's led to. You've got to have, and you've got to be true with yourself. That's the other thing too. So when we're living out these virtues, I could put on the political facade of like, hey, everything's great. I love everybody. I love America. You know, I'd kiss babies, whatever the case is. But then if behind the scenes, I've got, you know, all these, I'm having affairs and, you know, I'm really just in it for the politics and I'm playing the game and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's not living truthfully. And we can do that in a lot of ways with ourselves as well, you know, where we can say life is good, everything's fine, but we're really not fine. We're really not doing good. If we look at ourselves in the mirror, we go, man, I got a couple pounds to lose. And I'm, you know, I'm not paying attention to my kids. I'm not, you know, doing my best at work, you know, whatever the case is. We really, it's easy to get comfortable kind of living in little lies and instead of really living out the truth and making that a big part of our life and who we are. And so we've got to live truthfully. This was this chapter, by the way, was one of those that sprawled out initially into all kinds of stuff because I love apologetics when it comes to Christianity. I like getting into things like what is truth and how do we know truth, and you know, does a premise correspond with reality and those kinds of things. And there are a lot of great books, you know, out there that you can read on those kinds of topics. I decided to kind of chop some of that out, but I think that's really helpful for any guy who's listening to this, who's like, well, Mike, I want to live more truthfully. I think I like what it means to be true, but I don't always know how to tell the difference between, you know, an argument that is true versus an argument that's not true. I don't always know where I stand with something because I don't really know how to discern whether or not something that's being told to me is actually legit or if it's false. And so they need to be able to spot things like red herrings and other logical fallacies and really educate ourselves in truth. And I think that's really key. I didn't go into it in this chapter because that was sort of like a whole nother book in itself. But
Sure.
but I think that's really key, is that when we get into it, we really need to do a better job of teaching ourselves and of course teaching our kids how to spot truth versus false and falsehoods and be able especially to spot like logical fallacies because they're just happening constantly, especially from politicians.
Yeah, 100%. Teaching our kids to, and ourselves for that matter, to identify groupthink.
Yep.
Know how to think for yourself, and always just pursue the truth in everything. Yeah, that is huge. I feel like that topic, similar to your book, that topic alone could probably be a whole nother discussion, another podcast episode.
Yeah, and it's fun because once again, it's one of those things we don't talk about at all. It's not taught in schools unless you homeschool maybe. But you know, logical thinking, critical thinking skills, they're not taught. And at the same time, we're being sold to more often than ever before in history. So it makes sense to me. This is me doing my critical thinking here. If I live in a society that's going to sell to me more often than has ever happened in human history, I ought to know how to think critically about things so that I don't become somebody's target. You know, 100%. That just makes sense.
100%. Yeah, our kids especially, we're taught what to think, not how to think.
Yep.
And there's a big difference.
Yep.
Well, I love how the whole book kind of builds to the last idea of living spiritually. It's obviously an important thing for me. My faith is important to me and how I parent and how I live life. But I like how I can't remember exactly how you worded it, but basically if we're living by all of these other principles, we cannot help but find ourselves at the foot of the cross.
Yep.
And that just really jumped out at me. And it's like, yeah, that's true. I mean, true. You can live, how we've been talking and not be a Christian, but I just feel like if you don't give Christianity an honest, hard look at that point, you're kind of being like intellectually dishonest with yourself.
Yeah.
That's my perspective.
No, that's what I see as well. And that's one of the reasons why I didn't lead in with spirituality, is because the path that a lot of guys are taking these days is almost kind of a ground up understanding of what does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to be a good man? Because they didn't have that. So they're kind of getting foundational stuff. They don't even have a social construct of what that really means. And so they're getting that foundational stuff. And as they begin to really dive into these things, they begin to ask questions like psychological questions, big questions like, how did we all get here? Is there really any purpose in the world? What does it all mean? Those kinds of things. And if they're being intellectually honest, kind of like, as you said, at some point they should say, there seems to be at least an inkling of rationale. This is where they start. An inkling of rationale that would lead me to believe that there might be a creator of some kind. Is there any evidence out there for that? And I think you're just going to, as you kind of move along in life, if you're really being honest, eventually you're going to find Christ. You're going to explore Christianity. And I don't know of anything else that can stand up to the scrutiny, to the critical thinking, all that kind of stuff that you may have built into and learned as you kind of go along with your journey. Most of the guys that get to this point and they say, nah, Christianity, no, that's not it for me. Usually they have a story of hurt in their past, hurt by the church, hurt by God in some ways, hurt by their understanding of what Christianity is, those kinds of things. And it's just a mental block. No, that can't be true. That can't be right. I don't want to join in on that. But if they're honest and they're open, I think they're going to be led there, and they're going to have a decision to make. And if they cut themselves short and they say, well, I'm not going to believe in this, I'm not going to believe that we're spiritual, I'm not going to believe that we have a creator, they're going to find themselves, everything else begins to unwind. All of the other stuff, well, there's no truth then. There's no, what are virtues other than social construct that make us feel good? What are, everything else that they've learned begins to kind of unwind itself without a kind of the culmination of, no, we're spiritual beings made for a purpose by a creator who's intentional and believes in truth and, loves goodness and all that kind of stuff. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 100%. Yeah. I think that when we have Christ in our life, our place in history makes more sense.
Yep.
Our role as human beings and as men makes more sense. It's just our role in the world becomes more clear. And the belief in Christ, it heals old wounds, like you said, helps us come to terms with what may have happened in our life. And because of all that, we end up becoming, I think, a better person than we maybe would have been without Christ.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, the guys that are really on a path of pursuing becoming better fathers and husbands and leaders and all of that kind of stuff, they really want something good from themselves, probably something that they didn't get when they were a kid. They don't want to make the mistakes of their parents and those kinds of things. As a lot of us come to the table with that kind of mindset. The problem is that most of us make the mistakes that our parents made or our own mistakes due to some kind of unhealed wound, some kind of trauma that we've got that happened probably in our childhood that we haven't dealt with, either how we were raised, something that happened, events that we may not even remember. And the problem is that we will actually act out things that are anti who we want to be until that gets healed.
Right.
And so like, I want to be a good dad, but dang it, I just get so angry. I want to be a faithful husband, but I just can't stop, anytime I see another girl, I just, whatever. I want to be a guy who lifts and gets heavy or gets strong and does these things, but I just keep, falling off the wagon. I want to stop drinking. And you just go, well, what's tripping me up? Well, it's something in your heart that's tripping you up. Well, what heals that? Well, it's a knowledge that you are loved and that you're created for a purpose. And you start to go down this journey of, like Christ actually, is somebody that I can turn to that takes these wounds away and begins to make sense of the world and who I am in it and all that kind of stuff. Without that, there's a really good chance that guys are just going to stay in their hurt and continue making the mistakes that they don't want to make. With Christ, like you said, a lot of those things get healed. Now we start to come out of the fog and things begin to make sense.
100%. And for those guys who are on the quest to become the ultimate man, I mean, if you're looking for a model, Jesus is not the pale faced skinny dude, although he may have been skinny, but holding the lamb, that's not who Jesus
Yeah.
Maybe he did all those things, but Christ was a dude.
Yeah.
He was a rough dude. You think about all the way that they lived, the way they traveled from town to town, walking with very little food and supplies, nothing but the clothes on their backs. And then his ability to be bold in front of thousands of people who, most of whom didn't know who he was or didn't like him, and still win people over. It just blows my mind when you just think about him as a man.
Yeah. Hanging out with fishermen, you know, the roughest guys out there. And, you know, he's, you know, basically making his way through crowds of Romans and Jews and everybody else. And, hey, here, listen to what I got to say, you know, and he's going to go do that the next day, fighting through crowds. And, you know, basically his life is on the line, you know, for years at a time. Yeah, it's awesome. And in the life he lived, there's no way. I still, you know, I like the Chosen series that's come out. I think it's really, really good. I still don't, I would imagine that it was probably even rougher than that, you know, because there's still characters that have to look good on film and all that kind of stuff. I still imagine that Jesus was probably more, you know, more of a rougher guy even than what was shown in his own kind of way. You know, the Bible basically says he wasn't anybody that you would look at and go, oh yeah, let's follow that guy. You know, he just didn't come across that way. And that's, you know, it's hard to portray that with, you know, movies and TV shows, which like I said, I love The Chosen. I think it's great. But, yeah, that's the thing, is that Jesus was a man in every conceivable way. There's a great little book called The Manliness of Christ, by Thomas Hughes. And, it's a weird read nowadays because just the way it was written in the 1800s, but he was really taking that to task. These guys young guys of the day were like, Jesus is you know, he's the shepherd. He's the guy, you know, who has time to do his hair. And then he goes out and reads poetry to people while he's, you know, nursing a lamb back to life or something, whatever. You know, he wasn't like a man, and that wasn't how he was depicted for so long. And these guys really kind of downplaying Jesus and going after these other guys. And Thomas Hughes was like, let me actually tell you in a little book here about how manly Jesus was. And he just outlines Christ's life. And he's like, at this moment, he was a man, you know. And it's awesome to see that. And I love it too, because it's such an unexplored territory for Christian men, you know, to really think about Jesus as a man. John Eldridge did a good book on it, and as well. But that's something that I think a lot of guys need to wake up to, is like, oh, like Jesus was like, he was awesome. He was the guy. And, you know, he's certainly somebody we want to model ourselves after.
100%. Oh man, I know you mentioned that this book, I think you said it took 6 years to write.
Yeah. Yep.
That's a process. So I'm curious, and this is a big question, but I mean, through that process and now the book is out and you're getting feedback and whatnot, looking back, what did you learn about yourself or about life? Any big takeaways or aha moments?
Yeah, definitely a lot. A lot of things have changed since then. For me, I mean, like when I first started this, Wolf and Iron was a kind of a blog still. I don't even think we had a podcast. And I was literally starting this kind of as a project in my lunchtime. And there were some chapters where I was like, I know I want to write about this subject, but I don't really know exactly what I want to say. And so I had to kind of grow over the years, you know, to kind of visit that. The book is not gigantic, by the way. So if you're, you know, if somebody's looking at it, well, 6 years, it must be a freaking Bible. No, it's, you know, I did some other things in between then. It was a lot more not writing than there was writing. But
it is a very easy read.
Yeah, it's an easy read. And I decided, you know, I have a theory. I don't know if it's true or not, but I have a theory about books that I really like. And that is, there's a space that the author allows between the words for your own thoughts. And so rather than being exhaustive and just vomiting on the page, I want to kind of trim more and have more space for you to kind of catch the idea and go, huh, yeah, that seems right. Is that true? You know, and then, because that's going to do a lot more for a guy than just spelling out everything, you know. Anyhow, but the things that I've learned about myself, I don't know, it's been so much. I mean, my wife and I, we've been nearly divorced a couple of times. We've been to so much counseling. I've had to do so much introspective work. And then we've started a business called Rustic in Maine, where we make wedding rings out of historic woods. That's been going great for the last 5 years now. Wolf and Iron's grown to the podcast and some other things. I think as I reflect on the last 6 years, though, here's the thing that scares me. Here's the thing that I've seen. When Wolf and Iron first started about 7.5 years ago, I could see that there was a need for men to step up and be men. Art of Manliness had been out for about 5 years, I guess, and that was the first kind of like men's online kind of big thing. And that was doing really well, obviously. But there was so much of a vacuum in terms of like for men to be like resources for men to be men. We just didn't have that. Well, now we've got a lot more resources. I mean, we got all these Navy SEALs coming out with books and doing stuff, Jocko and all these guys that are awesome. And we've got a lot of guys that are doing podcasts like what you're doing and that kind of stuff, which is cool. At the same time, the progression of a progressive mindset where transgenderism has been like so hyped, homosexuality has been so hyped, anti-man and just effeminate kind of nature, and just a general confusion about like, who am I as a male, as a female? What am I supposed to be doing in my life? That has progressed extremely quickly since when I began.
Yeah.
Like it is a full on, like it's a war zone that I didn't expect to happen. I thought that there was going to be like a trickle effect for like another 10 years. And then that next generation after that would really be, no, man, it's like all gloves are off. Every major platform that we are interacting with, every major news channel, everything is really anti our values one way or another. And,
100%.
and that means the lines are being drawn more clearly, which I think is good.
It is good. And it is also scary to see how, like you said, the rate at which all of this is accelerating over the last 5 to 10 years. It's astounding. And I think it's kind of caught a lot of people on their heels.
Yeah.
So it's good that we've got books like yours, podcasts like yours, like mine, like there's a million of them out there. There is a movement afoot, I feel. So it's good that, guys like yourself are stepping up to the plate with stuff like this. So you mentioned Wolf and Iron, Rustic in Maine. You've got this book. Like, where can people go to like catch up and follow you and keep track of what you're working on and what you've got coming up?
Yeah, I'd say just go to wolfandiron.com. Wolf and Iron. Head over to wolfandiron.com and you can just hit me up there if you want to. You can follow me on social media for as long as that lasts. I think that's, I mean, just being honest. I mean, who knows?
Yeah.
We've got some other kind of stuff coming up in the next few months. That'll be pretty interesting. Ways to kind of maybe get off of some of the Instagram and some of that stuff and really get more intentional groups of guys together. So be on the lookout for that. The next book I do will probably be a fiction book. So, but it'll be cool. So not necessarily in the same vein. I just need a little bit of a break, but
Sure.
this is intense stuff. Like when you're talking about, manhood and things like that, it's a lot to wrap your mind around. Like, am I saying something that in 15 years, I'm going to go, ooh, I wish I hadn't said that,
Yeah.
So it's been a big project and I'm glad. And by the way, the audio book, I'm actually working on that this month. So the audiobook version of Tending the Fire will be out relatively soon. But yeah, just go to Wolf and Iron. Yeah, I'm reading it. Yeah.
Good,
so
good.
Yeah, it'll be fun. I figured, one, it'll save me money. 2, I have a microphone and people are used to my voice from the podcast and everything. So it'll be good.
Yeah. That's awesome, man. Well, it's exciting stuff. Again, it's a fantastic book. I'm working my way through it, but I recommend you guys listening and watching, go out there, get yourselves a copy. It's called Tending the Fire, Ignite Your Heart and Live Life as a Man. It's very needed in our current society. Mike, I want to thank you for your time. And I just encourage you, those listening and watching, go find Mike, because I consider him to be a thought leader in this space. So appreciate your time and all that you bring to the table, man.
Thanks, Mark. I really appreciate it.
Guys, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's conversation, share it with a friend and subscribe to the show so you don't miss future episodes like the one you heard today. And be sure to check today's show notes for all the ways you can stay plugged into the Inspired Legacy, including my free download called 9 Ways to Be a Better Dad. You can sign up for my free weekly devotional called Inspired Inbox. And you can join the private Facebook group, a community of other like-minded men looking to become the best husbands and fathers they can be. So get plugged in. Like, subscribe, leave a review, and help more guys find the show, because we need more men battling together for the sake of the next generation. Until next time, live inspired.